What's up, nigga?
You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and welcome to another episode of Random Thoughts. I was debating making this a Random Thoughts or not, but it's going to be fairly loosely edited, and I'm not going to put in a ton of relevant clips and shit like that, so I'm calling it a Random Thoughts. You can call it whatever the fuck you want. But I wanted to compare The Stick of Truth and The Fractured But Whole. That's the two South Park RPGs. Now, I've always been a big fan of the South Park games ever since I was a kid. I liked the first-person shooter one, even though it's really janky and hasn't aged the best. And I'm personally a huge fan of Chef's Love Shack, which is a really, really weird take, because Chef's Love Shack is one of the least popular South Park games, but I fucking love it. That game is great. I love trivia, so that's, probably why I like it so much. But I also like the mini-games and stuff. It's a party game, right? It's mini-games and trivia. That's all it is. Pretty simplistic. Definitely one of the lower end as far as, what you can do in it and technological advances and shit like that. Chef's Love Shack is a very simple game. I like South Park Rally as well, although it can get frustrating, but it is unique as a kart racer because it does have a variety of different types of races that are unique to it. I've also played that unreleased South Park Game Boy game on stream before. That one's pretty fun, too. Certainly not my favorite of the games, but it's pretty fun. And then the first one where I think it genuinely gets, really, really good was South Park Let's Go Tower Defense Play, which, as I've mentioned before, I was one of the top 3 players. Number 3, to be specific. 2 and 1 were my friend Duty and my friend South Park. The 3 of us were the top of the leaderboard for years. Don't know about now. Haven't played it in years online. But the point is, we were the top of the leaderboard for a long time, and that was great, and I've already talked about that in a couple of other videos. But of course, all of the South Park games would be completely overshadowed by The Stick of Truth when that came out. Because, at the time, The Stick of Truth was easily the best South Park game to come out. And then The Fractured But Whole was the sequel to that. And these two games obviously dwarf all of the others. These games are fucking great. Not only is it, partially because I do love RPGs, but it's also because that these games actually feel like you're playing the show. Tons of callbacks, references, and stuff put into it. The art style matches the show perfectly. The writing is fucking phenomenal. It actually was written by Trey and Matt. It actually is like a South Park episode, only it's a full-length RPG. Now, I say full-length, but these are shorter than a lot of other RPGs. Stick of Truth can be beaten in 11 hours, whereas Fractured But Whole takes around an average of 18 hours to beat. Now, as you guys know, my interest in South Park did wane quite a bit, with Season 20 and onwards, slowly losing interest more and more, which was a shame, obviously, because South Park is one of my favorite shows, and I've actually been rewatching a bunch of it since I've played through these games, because I've played through Stick of Truth and Fractured But Whole back-to-back now. I've played through them both a few times in the past, but it had been a while. Now, Stick of Truth I played through an obscene amount of times, probably 10. Whereas Fractured But Whole, I think this is my 4th playthrough. Maybe 5th if we're being generous, but I think it's my 3rd or 4th. And I'm still playing through the DLC. I've already beaten Bring the Crunch tonight, and then I'm currently working on From Dusk Till Casa Bonita. But I kind of wanted to compare the games, right? So, both of them are RPGs, and they have similar mechanics in a lot of regards. But one of the key differences is the tile system introduced in Fractured But Whole functions entirely differently than the combat system in Stick of Truth. In Stick of Truth, players and enemies are in a set spot on the board, and you can only attack ones that aren't blocked by other ones unless you have an attack that has splash damage. Whereas Fractured But Whole lets you move around in tiles, and you have to be in certain ranges to do certain attacks. In addition to that, Stick of Truth you use weapons, whereas Fractured But Whole you don't use weapons, you use powers, so that's another pretty key difference in the way the games play. That said, in Fractured But Whole, I often don't bother upgrading my weapons all that much, because I use the Mage class, and I usually just spam Dragon's Breath and Pyreball, which is one of the key things that is also different. In Stick of Truth, if you just pick a Mage class and spam Dragon's Breath and Pyreball after you've upgraded them, it makes combat super fucking easy. It's so easy. It's completely broken and lets you breeze through the game. Now, the combat's a little bit more balanced in Fractured But Whole in that regard, and if you're not playing the Mage class in Stick of Truth, it's a little bit more balanced. But that said, there's plenty of things to exploit in the Fractured But Whole as well. And there are a lot of mechanics that can actually make combat really easy in that. I actually died very few times for most of this playthrough. So far, the thing that's killed me the most was the final battle of Bring the Crunch. That one I just had to stock up on a shitload of healing items, and then I got it down. And I also leveled up a couple of times. Another key difference is in the Stick of Truth, your costumes or armor, whatever you want to call it, have different stats that go with them. So those stats are applied when you put them on. You know, they have different defense stats, plus they have effects and things like that. But then also they have a modifier slot. Some of them have 2 modifier slots that allow you to modify them and cause other effects. Your weapons similarly have modifier slots in addition to their stats. Fractured But Whole got rid of all of that. It basically just makes it so that all of the outfits are purely cosmetic, which I can see both ups and downs to. Obviously, having it be purely cosmetic, you can wear whatever the hell you want and not have it affect your stats, which I think is good. And I also think that the artifact system that they introduced in Fractured But Whole does mitigate that a lot, because you put in different artifacts that have different effects and raise your stats. And you get more artifact slots as you level up. Obviously, not having weapons, having powers instead makes it a lot more class-focused. You do get to use multiple classes as you play, and eventually you can just use powers from any class once you reach a certain point in the game. Another thing that does make combat a little bit broken in Fractured But Whole, though, is when you play the DLC, any items you get in the DLC carry over to every save file. So I had a shitload of Sacred Ground vials, those things that revive you and then possess you and like give you protection, and I was able to use them to play battles that I was massively underleveled with in this playthrough of Fractured But Whole a couple of times. Wasn't as big of a thing later on, because I didn't really have to use it a ton. In fact, even early on I didn't have to use it a ton, but it did help me through one battle in particular that I wasn't particularly well leveled for. Not to mention I had access to both Mintberry Crunch and Henrietta as soon as I was able to equip party members, because again, once you play through the DLC, you have access to both those new classes and you have access to those characters in your party right from the beginning of the game. So basically it's kind of like a new game plus once you played the DLC. Obviously, another difference is the setting. Stick of Truth is, you know, fantasy, where it's like, you know, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, that kind of thing. And, like, that's the game that they're playing within the game. But then there's a real-world plot of aliens coming down, their ship crashing, and spilling out this toxic goo that turns people into Nazi zombies. There's a lot more of a focus on a real-world thing overlapping with their game in Stick of Truth than there is in Fractured But Whole. There's a little bit of it in Fractured But Whole, but nowhere near as much and nowhere near as directly tied to the plot. Fractured But Whole also expands the map quite a bit, adding in a bunch more areas into the town, and there's also some inconsistencies. For instance, Jimmy's house is blue in the Stick of Truth, whereas it's red in the Fractured But Whole, whereas the red one is actually the more accurate one, and a couple of things are in slightly different spots, but the layout is very similar. There's just more of the town, and some things were slightly moved. Fractured But Whole does have more that it feels more complete in a lot of ways, and they also handle summons a little bit differently. Summons are a lot more overpowered in Stick of Truth, but they can only be used once per day and not against bosses, and there's 4 days in the game counting post-game. Whereas Fractured But Whole, you just get a set amount of each summon, with the exception of Moses, who you can summon. It is still a set amount, but you have to actually craft the items. I think you get a total of 12 in the game. Whereas the other ones, for instance, Classy, you just get them all at once. And then the cheesing vials for Gerald, you have to actually find. And then Jimbo and Ned, you just get them all at once. Anyway, so yeah, there's a lot of little differences here and there. They both have a ton of references to the show, both old and new episodes. And I think that's fucking great. They both reference all sorts of things you wouldn't expect them to, and really feel like you're in the show, able to explore and experience things from various eras of the show. Again, neither of the games are particularly hard. I am going to try to beat Morgan Freeman this time around, which I've never done before. Anyway, actually comparing the two, I would say by every objective gameplay metric, Fractured But Whole is the better game. It just has a lot more advanced gameplay. There's a lot more quality of life changes that are a lot better done. And there's a lot of things in it that I think play better. There are some small things I prefer in Stick of Truth. And depending on my mood, sometimes I like the things in Stick of Truth's combat system better. It really just depends. That said, I think that gameplay-wise, Fractured But Whole is clearly the better game. However, when it comes to story, While it's not by a country mile, I think Stick of Truth does have a better story. Fractured But Whole has this going for it, that it's longer. The slightly longer length does help that. But I do think the story definitely is more entertaining and more gripping in Stick of Truth, and I think that is partially due to the overlapping game within the game and the real-world plots, even if they both are fucking ridiculous. Both games have twist final bosses, and both of those twist final bosses are great. However, with Fractured But Whole, once you defeat the final boss, it just has a very, very short segment and then goes to credits. Whereas Stick of Truth has a nice end cutscene that resolves everything, and also ends with your character talking for the only time he talks in either of the games. Whereas Fractured But Whole just kind of abruptly ends. So that is definitely a little bit anticlimactic. I think that is a little bit mitigated by the fact that it has DLC. The DLC definitely adds onto it and makes it more entertaining. But story-wise, I do think Stick of Truth is the better game as far as story. But as far as gameplay, Fractured But Whole is better. So I actually don't know which of these games I prefer. They're both great, and I think that the differences between them also make them both have a unique feel. So, obviously, I think they're both great games, so it's hard for me to say which is better. I think probably Fractured But Whole is slightly better. One thing that is a point against it for me personally is it does have a lot of references to the seasons that I don't like as much. That said, they don't have a ton of those references, because this one came out during Season 21, so it doesn't have, like, Tegrity Farms or any of that bullshit I hated in it. But it does have a lot of little references to the newer seasons that I'm not as keen on. But again, they're actually pretty fun references, and there's not a ton of them, so it's whatever. Like I said, it doesn't ruin it for me, and I actually do think a lot of these references are well done and are funny. That's, like, I still like, you know, some of the newer seasons. It's just, you know, my interest declined more and more over time, so it's not like these references are all inherently bad. In fact, I would argue most of the references are great, and most of them are actually references to older episodes, like Mephisto's Lab being in a big entire playable level, and I think that's a huge selling point. That's probably one of the best parts of the story, is going to Mephisto's Lab. I fucking love that level. But yeah, both these games are great, and if you're a South Park fan and haven't played them, I don't know what the hell is wrong with you. These games are fucking fantastic. I'm not going to play Snow Day, though. Snow Day looks like shit. But yeah, both these games are great, and it is hard to pick a favorite between the two. And like I said, depending on my mood and depending on the day will determine which one I actually say is better. At the moment, I think Fractured But Whole is slightly better, but that's just because it, again, gameplay-wise is way better. And again, we're talking better in this case by my own taste. It's objectively better, like I said, gameplay-wise. But as far as which one I prefer, at the moment it's currently Fractured But Whole, but I go back and forth all the time. So it's really hard to determine. That's how you know they're both great games, though, is when they're comparable in quality. They're both really, really fun. And in a lot of ways, I feel like these games are kind of the send-off to the good era of South Park, because obviously after them is really when I started to lose interest. Like, again, Season 18 was a pretty big downgrade from the previous seasons. Hell, I think you could argue that 15, 16, and 17 were already starting to decline a little bit, but I still think they're really good. Like I said, I think the golden era of South Park is Season 6 through 14. That's like when it's all really good. That's basically perfect. But these games, to me, in a lot of ways, feel like almost the end of South Park. These are the send-off, even though it is still going, and I'm still probably going to try and slog through a little bit of it. I've watched a little bit of Season 25, and it was fine. It wasn't great, but it was fine. Like, it was just fine. That's all it was. And that's kind of what I thought it would be. The mediocrity is almost more disappointing than how angry Season 20 made me, to be honest. Anyway, that's all I really have to say. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Random Thoughts. Have a good one. Toodles.
What a grand adventure this has been. God bless us, everyone.
God, yeah. As soon as I can walk again, I'm gonna kick that kid's ass.
Subscribe to Fugitive Red Eye.